I have a question for you. When was the last time that Nikon released a fast wide-angle prime? Was it a decade ago, a couple years ago, or maybe even a quarter century ago? Well, Nikon last released a 14mm f2.8D back in the year 2000. And it wasn't until this lens came out, the Viltrox 16mm f1.8, that we got a fast wide-angle prime for the Nikon Z mount. Now, this lens obviously is not made by Nikon, but it's the last time we were able to get a lens like that, which is great for wide-angle landscape photography, even astrophotography. And to me, this is a lens that's really interesting that could fill a major gap within the Nikon Z ecosystem. I've been testing out for the last couple of shoots, and I'm ready to make a full review on this lens. Now, image quality for me was the biggest focus that I had when it came to the Viltrox 16mm. And there's two areas in particular that I really want to look at. First one was vignetting, and the second one was sharpness. Now, when it came to vignetting, this was an area that I felt like the Viltrox was most weak in, because especially when it came to shooting at f1.8, you can see that there's quite a bit of vignetting, especially at those edges, and it's quite dark. I also found that there was a slight teal shift in those areas of vignetting, which made it a little bit more difficult to clean up, especially in post-production, and I found it was more prevalent, especially when shooting by the water. And having a lot of vignetting at f1.8 really isn't an issue when you're shooting a lot of other forms of landscape photography, especially because you're going to be stopping down to around f8, f4 anyways when you're shooting regular landscape images. But at 1.8 vignetting, that's mainly going to be an issue when we're shooting astrophotography. And shooting at an f1.8 is an absolute necessity because you want as much light coming into the frame as possible. So you're really going to see that vignetting issue mainly prevalent when it comes to astrophotography. But when using this lens for landscape photography, we are going to want to stop down this lens to around at least f4. Because at f4 is where we're going to have the best vignetting performance, where we see those edges clear up quite a bit. Although there still is a relative amount of vignetting there, it's not a whole lot to deal with, but it is still prevalent. Now, one quick note that I do want to have about this lens isn't actually about this lens's performance, but the ND filters that you're going to be pairing with the Viltrox. You want to make sure you have really nice ND filters where vignetting is quite controlled and there isn't much of a color shift. Because if you, let's just say, had an ND filter on here that didn't have very good vignetting performance, and then you were also using the Viltrox, you're going to get a level of vignetting that really isn't that pleasant to deal with and may be difficult to correct in post-production. So just make sure you have good lens filters, because this is a 16mm focal length, so it is quite wide and will catch most of that vignetting. Now, even though vignetting with this lens is a little bit more of a weak point, the sharpness on this lens is actually quite exquisite. Because when we're shooting at even like an aperture like f1.8, we are getting quite sharp photos in the center in particular. They have plenty of detail, you're able to resolve the image quite a bit. I was mainly shooting with my 24 megapixel Nikon Z6 III, and I found that I didn't have an issue when it came to resolving that amount of megapixels. So I'm pretty confident that this lens can definitely handle a much higher resolution camera like a Z8 or a Z7 II. And when we stop down that lens even further to around that f8 point, we really see the corners look pretty good. I'm pretty happy with how the corner performance looks. Yes, we do get a bit of smearing at those corners, but that's just naturally how wide angle lenses are. This is still an issue with something like my 14 to 30mm from Nikon, so this isn't an area that I think you have to be too concerned about when it comes to this lens's sharpness, especially in those corners. But overall, this lens's image quality is actually pretty good. And I'll be very honest with you guys, when it came to using these Viltrox, there's a lot of the physical components that I didn't really use that much. I didn't really use the display much, or the function buttons, or this on and off switch for the click or declickable aperture ring. I just didn't find them super useful. However, there is one feature of this lens that I found myself using quite a bit, and it was this aperture ring. Because when I was on shoot, I found myself just quickly gravitating towards it if I wanted to change my aperture, instead of having to spin this front command dial. I found it far faster and more convenient to use than simply turning that command dial. And because majority of the time I'm using f8 anyways, I would just set it to f8 and then just leave it there. And additionally, being able to turn that click on made it so that was nice hard stop, so I know exactly where my aperture was going to be set to. Now, I just found this so much easier to use on shoot, and personally, I would actually use this in the future. And especially coming from someone that had the ability to set the control rings on a lot of my other lenses to that aperture control, and someone that didn't use them, I feel like this actually made a lot more sense because that clickable stops. That's just something that wasn't available in regular Nikon glass. And another physical component of this lens that I was quite surprised about was actually how well it held up against the elements. Because I took this lens out to a handful of shoots, and majority of them were by the ocean. In fact, all of them were by the ocean. And I found that there wasn't any major issues with water getting into the lens, and trust me, we got splashed a lot with water, so there was definitely a lot of opportunities to test this lens out when it comes to that front. I didn't find there's any major issues with the weather sitting component of it, so I have some confidence that this is going to hold up pretty well over the long run. And if you take a look at this lens, I mean, this isn't a small lens at all. It's quite a long lens, especially for a prime lens. But to be honest with you, I am really happy with the form factor of it. I think it has a nice size to it, a nice weight. It's definitely a little bit heavier than something like my 14-30, which comes in at around 425 grams, whereas this 16mm is 550 grams. And honestly, I didn't feel like the weight was something that was major about this lens, but I definitely felt like it balanced really well with a full frame camera like my Nikon Z6 III that I have here. On top of it, it being a little bit longer relative to something like that 14-30 wasn't a major issue. Again, it felt really good in the hands when I was using it, and it fit well inside of my camera bag, so I didn't feel like there was any major issues when it came to the size of the 16mm. Like, even though this lens wasn't the most compact or the smallest lens, I didn't feel like its size or weight interfered with anything that I was doing with my landscape photography. And overall, I'm pretty happy with how this lens was ergonomically. This 16mm fills a major gap within the Nikon Z ecosystem, giving us that fast wide-angle prime that performs well in areas like image quality as well as resistance to the elements. I'm pretty happy with this lens overall and its performance, and I think this is a lens that a lot of landscape photographers will gravitate towards at the end of the day, because Nikon simply just doesn't have a lens like this in the Nikon Z ecosystem, which I do want Nikon to make. I think just because this lens isn't out doesn't mean that Nikon shouldn't come out with something like a 14mm f1.4. That would be an incredibly cool lens, especially utilizing that full Nikon Z mount. And honestly, I've enjoyed really using this prime lens over my 14-30mm. I've always loved prime lenses as a wide angle side of things because you're just having a different perspective. You can't simply zoom in to get the exact composition you want. You actually have to work for it to move your camera in and out. And I think 16mm was the perfect focal length to use on this lens. And also being at f1.8, this is a lens that a lot of astrophotographers are going to find very viable for when they go out and shoot things like the stars, for example, because you want that fast, wide open aperture, and you get it with this lens. And the great part of this lens is its price point. It comes in at $580, which is not bad at all for a full frame wide angle lens. If you compare it to something like the 14-30mm f4S, which is obviously not the same lens, but when it comes to wide angle lenses, that lens is around $1,100 to $1,200 versus $580. That's an absolute steal for a great wide angle lens that suits a lot of landscape photographers' needs. So I can absolutely and honestly very easily recommend this lens for landscape photographers. If you're looking for that nice wide angle lens that's able to capture those wide expansive landscapes, this may be it for you, especially if you wanted that fast f1.8 aperture. So what do you guys think about the Viltrox 16mm f1.8? Is this a lens that you would get for your landscape photography? Let me know down in the comment section down below. Thank you guys so much for experiencing the world with me today, and please feel free to rate, comment, subscribe. I'll catch you guys in the next one.